There was a time in the 70s and 80s when kids growing up in Melbourne could play the fun game, will the next train be red, blue, or silver? By the time I was a kid in the 90s, all the trains were green and yellow, but many parents encouraged a similar game, often while waiting at level crossings, namely, let's guess the number of carriages. At this point, the more observant of children could turn to their parents and point out that there were only two possibilities, 3 or 6. And today, the majority of our lines are operated by 6-car trains exclusively. The combination of carriages making up a train is called a consist, and when that consist is standardised with groups of cars that stay together, it's usually called a set. In this video, we're going to take a look at the physical makeup of Melbourne suburban trains, how we came to use the standard sets we do today, and why most of our trains still have a pair of driver's cabs in the middle. This video may well be the nerdiest one I've done to date, so if you're not into that kind of thing, I'm sorry. And if you are into that kind of thing, I'm sorry I didn't do it sooner. Individual cars on Melbourne suburban trains can be identified by their car number, which is clearly displayed externally and slightly less clearly internally on these labels near the emergency buttons, unless you're on one of our newest trains, the HCMTs, in which case they're displayed large on the wall. On all train types except for the HCMTs, the number is followed by a letter, either M or T. These letters stand for motor or trailer, defining whether that particular car is powered or not. But there's a bit more to it than that, so first, some history. When electric operation of Melbourne's suburban network began in 1919, our first electric trains, the Tate and Swingdoor sets, were made up, broadly speaking, of 3 different types of car. There were also several subtypes, but I'm not going to go too deep into that here. First and most importantly, there were the motor cars, classified M. The M cars had a driver's cab at one end, 4 traction motors to propel the train, 1 on each axle, a pantograph on the roof to collect electricity, and all the other electrical bits and bobs that were needed in between these things. The M cars were fully self-contained and were perfectly able to move by themselves if required. Note that the term motor could refer to the actual traction motors on the axles, but more generally the term can be used to refer to the whole car which has the traction motors fitted, so when I say motor, I'm talking about an M car. Next up, the trailer cars, classified T. T cars were unpowered, with no traction motors, no pantograph, and no cab. They don't play any role in making the train move, they're just there for passenger capacity. The third type were the driving trailers, classified D. D cars were unpowered, just like a trailer car, but were fitted with a driver's cab at one end, allowing them to lead the train. Together, these cars ran together in divisible sets, and this type of arrangement is called an electric multiple unit, or EMU. The control and lighting circuits for each car are connected together using multiple unit cables, which allow all the motor cars in the train to work together, controlled by the driver in the leading cab. The Westinghouse air brakes are also continuous along the entire train, recharged by air compressors mounted on the M cars. The standard makeup of suburban trains for most of the 20th century, up until the early 80s, was a 4-car set called a block, made up of 2 motor cars and 2 trailer cars. During peak times, an additional 3 cars, known as a unit, were attached to make up a 7-car train. While these sets were used as standard, at this time the cars were very much treated as individual vehicles, and it wasn't uncommon for a failed car to be removed or replaced in a set, and special makeups using non-standard arrangements of cars also happened. The great thing about an EMU is that you can basically put it together however you want, as long as there's a cab at each end and a high enough ratio of powered cars to unpowered cars to get up hills and maintain the timetable. Something you might notice is that in these standard sets, the 4-car block has 50% powered cars, 2 motors and 2 trailers. But the 7-car set has a slightly lower power to weight ratio, with the trailer cars outnumbering the motors 4-3. Now you might notice I haven't mentioned the driving trailers here, and they weren't actually required as part of those standard sets, although they were often included in blocks in the place of one of the T cars. And you can see that in the preserved Tate set, which usually runs as an MTDM block. What the D cars were mostly used for was the operation of 2-car sets during very quiet times, which were made up of a single motor paired with a driving trailer. These could in turn be combined into a 4-car set, which could in turn have a unit added to become a slightly unconventional 7-car set, but still with the normal number of motors. There were many other variations to these consists. In fact, at one time or another, these trains ran in anything from a single-car train, using a motor car with a second cab fitted for double-ended operation, right up to 8-car sets using a pair of blocks towards the end of their lives. The very flat lines to Port Melbourne, St Kilda, Sandringham and Altona also sometimes used sets with a lower ratio of M cars, such as 3-car motor, trailer, driving trailer sets, which could be combined together into a 6-car set with just 2 motors. The blue Harris trains followed the same basic model of 4-car blocks and 3-car units, but the first real breakaway from this standard was with the Hitachi trains in 1972. They were delivered as a combination of 2-car MD units and conventional 4-car blocks, which could be combined together to run as a 6-car set with 3 motors. The length of each individual car was longer than with the previous trains, so a 6-car Hitachi was around the same overall length as the previous 7-car sets. The standard 4 and 7-car sets were always the same way around, with the 3-car unit on the east end at Flinders Street Station, which allowed it to be shunted off into the nearby Jolimont Yard. They always stayed on that end of the train because before the City Loop opened in the early 80s, there wasn't anywhere on the network where trains would actually get turned around in normal operation. It could theoretically happen if a train went up to Reservoir via the inner circle, then back via Jolimont, but there weren't any timetabled cases of that. However, when the City Loop opened, it became normal for trains to be turned on almost every run, so sets no longer had an east and a west end, and the standard makeup now needed to become symmetrical. For the Hitachi sets, this was managed by converting the driving trailers into standard trailer cars, ordering more motor cars, and rearranging the whole fleet into 3-car MTM sets, which could run together in pairs to form a 6-car set with 4 motors during the peaks. While most of the former driving trailers had their cabs fully removed, some only got a partial modification, and right up to the end of these trains' lives in the 2010s, there were still some trailers with their former cab externally intact. The new Comeng trains, which were entering service around the time the loop opened, followed the Hitachis with a 3-car MTM consist, and this would become the standard layout for suburban trains for the next 4 decades. While the individual cars on the Hitachi and Comeng trains were still pretty much self-contained, the thinking had changed a bit since the early days of EMUs, and each 3-car set was treated more as a permanent unit. In fact, the intermediate couplings within the set were semi-permanent bar couplings, not designed to be easily separated, and this meant that the 3 cars would always stay together, unless a car needed to be swapped out due to major accident damage. You can easily tell where this is the case, because after 4 decades of operation, most Comeng sets to this day are still in their original sets, with the 2 M cars numerically adjacent. For instance, 381M and 382M are at either end of the same set. But there are a small number of sets made up of orphaned cars. For instance, 499M and 534M are paired together, both of which lost their original partners at the hands of arsonists in separate incidents in 2002. When the Extrapolis and Siemens trains came along in the early 2000s, the basic concept of the MTM set continued, but the idea around how equipment should be located on the train did change a bit. With each 3-car set never normally being separated, the modern way of thinking was that there was no real need to keep all the heavy electrical equipment exclusively on the M cars, and there was really no reason not to distribute it more evenly along the train. In the case of the Comeng, the weight distribution is very uneven, with the M cars weighing about 50 tonnes, but the trailers closer to 35 tonnes, a pretty significant 15-tonne difference. This isn't entirely a bad thing. It's good to have more weight on the powered axles for better traction. If you look at a Comeng side-on, you can see the M cars have loads of equipment mounted between the bogies, while the T cars have hardly anything, and the same goes for all the earlier train types as well. However, both the Siemens and Extrapolis trains were designed with some electrical equipment mounted on the trailer car, bringing the vehicle weights much closer together, with a difference of about 8 tonnes on an X-Trap and just 4 tonnes on a Siemens. By far the most visually obvious example of the different equipment distribution is on the Extrapolis sets, which have a single shared pantograph mounted on the trailer car, rather than the traditional one on each M car. So the traction current is delivered to the Extrapolis M cars through cables running from the pantograph on the T car, and the M cars are clearly unable to move if separated from their trailer car companion. So how does all that translate into the makeup of our trains today in 2024? Well, the Comeng, Extrapolis and Siemens trains, which make up most of the fleet, now operate almost universally as 6-car sets, but they're still made up of those pairs of 3-car MTM sets, hence the cabs in the middle of the train. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, trains still ran as 3-car sets off-peak, combining into 6-car sets for the peak hours, and this was still happening in some places into the early 2010s, but by then patronage on the network was soaring and 6-car sets started being needed full-time. As well as that, I think the philosophy changed a bit, that dividing and combining sets multiple times a day wasn't actually a very efficient use of time or infrastructure, and besides, the most expensive operating cost on an electric train is paying the driver, a cost which doesn't change based on the length of the train. However, despite the operational need for 3-car trains almost completely drying up, we continued ordering new trains as 3-car sets right up to the last Extrapolis deliveries in 2020. I assume this is partly because it would have cost more to change the design specifications, but another important consideration is that many of Melbourne's maintenance facilities are only set up for 3-car trains, so there is still a need to split them up for that, and this frequently results in different sets being paired together when they emerge from having work done. For instance, in late 2023, Metro rolled out a 6-car Extrapolis carrying a special Indigenous art livery, but it was only a matter of time until the set was split up, with each half being paired with a conventional non-art livery set. There are still 2 places on the network where 3-car sets are used in regular passenger service. The entire Alamein line operates as a shuttle off-peak from Camberwell, and this is run by a pair of 3-car sets. This is good fleet utilisation, as a single 6-car train can be split up to run the whole service, but it's also a limitation of the track layout at Camberwell. The shuttle comes in and detrains on platform 1 before running forward into this siding, which is only 3 cars long, and is in a very constrained space with no room to extend. The train then comes back into platform 3 as it heads back towards Alamein. You could do this with a 6-car set and avoid the siding by just reversing direction in one of the platforms, and the track layout does allow that. But the big advantage of the current pattern is that passengers are dropped off and collected from the same platform as the train they will connect with to or from the city. The other shuttle operates at certain times between Newport and Williamstown and also uses a pair of 3-car sets. You can fit a 6-car set in one of the 2 sidings here, and normally only one siding is used, so it would be possible to run this shuttle with 6-car sets if need be. It's also fairly common to see 3-car sets being used for test trains or for driver training purposes. So despite the 3-car sets still getting some use as 3-car sets, the reason our trains are made up like that is largely historical. The 2 centre cabs in our 6-car trains are for the most part wasted space that could be used for extra passenger capacity, and each cab also includes a lot of expensive equipment, which adds to the cost of new orders. So, unsurprisingly, when the time came to order a brand new design of train, the HCMT, the option was taken to have them as one continuous set. I'll explain how the HCMTs are made up in a moment, but just quickly, and for a bit more context, we're going to get distracted and have a quick look at how things are done in Sydney. Up until the late 80s, Sydney EMUs were made up of the same 3 basic car types as Melbourne. They even used the same letters for T and D cars. However, they classified their motor cars as C for control, and they put the letters on the other end of the number compared to Melbourne. I know, Sydney's crazy, right? Sydney generally ran their trains as 4 or 8-car sets, with each 4 cars being made up of CTTC, the same as a standard Melbourne MTTM 4-car block. But when the Tangara trains were introduced in 1988, they decided to really spice things up a bit. The Tangaras were still made up of 4-car sets, but the middle 2 cars were a new type. These are non-driving motor cars, classified N. So they have traction motors, but no cabs, and the outer 2 cars in the set are D cars. A lot of the electrical equipment is distributed along the set, including the pantographs, which are on the D cars. This became the basic layout of Sydney trains going forward, and was also the arrangement for Melbourne's experimental double-deck train, the 4D. Fast forward to the 21st century, and like Melbourne, Sydney was looking to have longer fixed trains. The Waratah sets were introduced in 2011, and followed the same basic pattern of the Tangaras, but as a fixed 8-car train with no centre cabs. So the overall consist is made up of a D car at each end, each with a pantograph, then a pair of N cars, and then 2 T cars in the middle, also carrying pantographs. Okay, so that was a very roundabout way of me describing what an N car is, and now we can return to Melbourne and talk about the HCMTs. The HCMTs are fixed 7-car sets, and annoyingly don't use Melbourne's traditional system of car classification. But since I've spent all this time teaching it to you, I'm going to describe them using the traditional terms anyway, and I'm going to borrow the term N from Sydney, seeing as we didn't historically have a local equivalent. These sets are a very similar arrangement to an 8-car Sydney Waratah, just with one less trailer in the middle. The HCMTs have a driving trailer at each end, followed by 2 non-driving motors, which carry the pantographs. Then there's a single trailer car in the middle, making up the 7-car set. There is apparently an option to extend these trains to 10 cars at some point in the future, which I assume would involve the addition of another 2 N's and a T in the middle. However, they didn't use these letters to classify the HCMT cars, and for the first time in Melbourne suburban train history, they also didn't include any classification letters physically displayed on the cars. Instead, just to complicate things, they made up new codes for each car, with the D cars being TC for trailer with cab, and what I've been calling N cars are classified MP for motor with pantograph. But there's two variations of this, as the outer two are fitted with an emergency fire door at each end, which for some reason they decided to include in the code, and they used a D for that, so those ones are DMP. Then the middle car almost got away with the normal T code, except that it also has a fire door, so it's classified DT. And none of these codes are actually displayed on the cars, so you just have to know. But the easy thing to remember is that on an HCMT, the powered cars are the ones carrying the pantographs. I'm sure the change of classification method was a good idea for someone, somewhere, internally, but to me it seems much harder to remember and an annoying deviation from standard practice. So these are all cool things to know, and talking about it will win you a lot of friends, but does any of it mean anything as a passenger? The answer is definitely sometimes. On a Comeng specifically, the fact that most of the electrical equipment is located on the M cars does create some varying conditions for passengers. The significant weight difference gives the M car a slightly smoother ride quality than the trailers, although it is pretty subtle. On the flip side, the M cars are much noisier. You've got the beautiful sound of the traction motors, and the air compressor, often accompanied by some significant vibration. Personally, I love these sounds and always try to ride in an M car to fully appreciate them. However, there's another sound which can get quite annoying. This high-pitched whine is the sound of the motor alternator set, which converts the 1500 volt traction voltage down to low voltage for onboard lighting and air conditioning, etc. On some cars, this sound can get remarkably loud, but the good news is, now you know what it is, you can avoid it by moving to the T car. The more modern trains are also slightly quieter in the trailer cars, but it's a smaller difference as the modern traction equipment is much quieter in the first place. Another thing that's useful to know is the differences in internal layouts. In Melbourne, the practice for wheelchair users is to board at the front of the train, where the driver assists boarding using a portable ramp. Then inside, there's ample room behind the driver's cab for several wheelchair-using passengers to travel. Because the wheelchair accommodation is always at the front of the train, this means any car that could be at the front of the train needs to have the required space. So those wheelchair spaces actually exist in 4 places along a 6-car train, one in each M car. This is really useful if you're travelling with a pram, bike or large items of luggage, as you can make use of those spaces at the middle and rear of the train. Obviously you need to keep in mind that they're still priority spaces, but it's extremely rare to have wheelchair passengers boarding anywhere other than the leading car. So there you go. Next time you ride on an EMU, take a moment to see what kind of carriage you're travelling in, and if you like relaxing to the sounds of electric traction equipment, make sure you hop in an M car. Thanks very much for watching.